Well, I'm talking today with Pastor Chopo Mwanza, and he needs no introduction for you all because you've had him as your professor and some of you have him as your pastor. And he just finished preaching through, or he's almost finished preaching through the book of Romans. So how many years have you been preaching through Romans?
4 years.
4 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
How many years had you known you wanted to preach through Romans before you started?
Well, the idea crossed my mind, but I never wanted to preach through Romans right away. One of the elders insisted that I preach through Romans. So I was preaching through Colossians. Then he said, "You have to preach through Romans." So I submitted to his counsel.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Elders need to submit to one another.
Exactly.
So that's great.
Exactly.
That's great. Yeah. I'm not sure how I feel about that elder if you want to preach the Romans. Interesting. Okay, so we want to talk about Romans, but also Paul's theology in general, as this is a class for Acts and Paul. Now, I'm curious what you would think about this, because I've heard some people say that Paul's epistles work really well in a Western kind of church. But outside of the West, in a place like Africa, you should avoid preaching on the epistles, but should preach on narrative because there's a different orientation. Now, you just preached the Romans for 4 years, so but you also understand something of the difference between the East and the West in the context, and I'm curious what you think about that advice. Where is there some truth in it? And yet, where does it, I'm presuming you would say, go wrong, as you just spent 4 years preaching through Romans?
Yeah, I think that kind of advice is springing from the general perception and mindset that's there. Africans generally think in narrative. We teach in narrative, or we don't necessarily think in a linear way. We think in a secular way, and so we have a lot of stories, a lot of parables in our teaching. However, I think it's helpful teaching the epistles, the didactic approach is helpful in thinking about what the Bible teaches. But also, you can teach the epistles in the narrative aspect can come out in the way you deliver it. So I think at times people think when you teach the epistles, you should be this dry, mechanical. The teaching or preaching should be dry, mechanical, and almost lifeless. But you can teach clearly logical truth in a 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of approach, but deliver it in a lively way that people are able to relate to in everyday life. So I think that's how you kind of approach that. So I think the African preachers need to force themselves to teach the epistles and think through in that logical and flow, and be able to use the ability to tell a story. Just as the Western preachers need to teach the narrative and be able to tell the story while bringing out the clear, logical points.
Good. I happen to notice a book sitting over there, Biblical Theology by Gerhardus Wallace.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've read the whole thing or parts of it.
Working through it.
Yeah, but he has such a strong, he doesn't really talk about Romans in that book.
Yeah.
Anyway, because it's actually not quite finished. But he has such a strong element of narrative in Paul's like the deep structure of narrative in
Mm-hmm.
Paul's theology.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if the African mindset is actually able to recognize that
Yeah.
sometimes better than in the West. Anyway.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah.
Yeah.
True.
So maybe the lesson isn't that you shouldn't teach the epistles in Africa, but rather nobody should be teaching the epistles in the way that those people who think you shouldn't teach the epistles think you should. Yeah.
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 Great. So next question here. Now scholars debate this, so this is in no way a test of your understanding of Romans. But do you think there is a theme verse in Romans? And if so, what is it?
Yeah. It's always tricky when you say theme verse, because in many ways there's a level of subjectivity to it. But if I was forced to pick, I would say Romans 1, 16 and 17, because it brings out both the aspect of the gospel and the righteousness of God. Because I would say, so my working theme has been, the righteousness of God in making us righteous in Christ Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the full argument of Paul, how God remains righteous in making sinners righteous through Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you then have the implications of the gospel, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So Romans 1, 16, 17, I think
Mm-hmm.
would be my pick.
Great. Yeah, and I would agree with you. Recognizing there's a subjectivity to it.
Yeah.
And if somebody said, if they picked an obscure verse in chapter 16, you might say, have you read the book?
Yeah, exactly.
But there's so much you can say there.
Yeah.
Now, thinking of Paul's theology overall, because you said, you also preached on Colossians, and you've taught Acts and Paul.
Yeah.
Do you think Paul's theology has a center to it, in the sense that there are some things more important in terms of how Paul is thinking through theology than other things? Again, like who he's saying, greet in chapter 16 versus chapter 3, where he's talking about how God remains righteous and gives righteousness to sinners.
Yeah.
Is maybe you've already said it in terms of your theme of Romans, but is there a center to Paul's theology, and what is it, and maybe also how did you arrive at that center?
Yeah, if I would say it in one word, I would say the gospel. That's very clear. Is one of the things that he's arguing for in almost every epistle. The gospel. And I would say the implications of the gospel. So he's arguing what the gospel is, what the results of the gospel are, or he's arguing what the gospel is not. So I would say the gospel. So justification by faith, sanctification, glorification, union with Christ, etc., etc., which are all components of the gospel. So I would say, even when he talks about the law and its relationships, it's in what's the relationship of the law to the gospel. Yeah. So I think the gospel is very central to Paul's theology and writing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think of 1 Corinthians 15. I mean, he says that is of first importance. Right. So that would be... great. So if you were to preach through Romans starting now, how might you think of it differently?
So having preached through kind of gives you a more clearer view of the whole. And I think if I was to re-preach it, I would make sure I emphasize the connection between the part to the whole. Because I think there were certain times when I preached sections and didn't emphasize their connection to the whole argument. So I think that's definitely one. Then they are, there are certain sections that I would have more clarity. And now, having preached through it and seen the flow of the argument, so I think that those would be aspects that would be different in how I preached it. In terms of practically, I think I would have, if I preached it to the church again, I would prepare a study guide to go with it, just to help with the application and the thought process. I would have I would also probably do every now and then Q&As to just, and that's more just applicational and practical in the context of our local church, to just help the church really grasp certain aspects of it.
I'm curious, was there a particular passage that had you the most stumped in terms of the meaning? As you
chapter 7.
Okay.
Chapter 7 was... chapter 7 was tricky. As to when he addresses the law, and also whether he's describing his life before or after conversion. That was very interesting. And even in a sense, chapter 6, when he talks about union in Christ, and it sounds easy and straightforward, but practically it raises all kinds of questions. And I think I don't think I quite took the time to address all the questions that would arise. I doubt you can answer all the questions that arise as you are preaching through a series, but I think I could have made more effort in answering all the practical implications of chapter 6, as he talks about, slaves to, no longer slaves to sin, and united to Christ.
I've never preached the Romans, but I've preached on Romans 6 multiple times. And every time I struggle to follow the train of thought. Like, why is this verse after that verse? There are things there that, even having preached that and studied that passage a lot, that it's that the logic still eludes me to some extent. So, has your theology changed at all? Maybe not in major ways, but subtle ways, or more confidence or less confidence in certain things as you've preached the Romans?
Definitely. I think it has cemented a number of things and put clarity on certain nuances. I think my understanding of the relationship between justification and sanctification, the whole idea of union with Christ. I mean, the number of times he talks about being in Christ. The concept of adoption as sons. I mean, that's something I'm still wrestling with. I think I understand it in theory, but I don't quite fully appreciate it, and in terms of its application and living it out. So I think those aspects, the whole the sovereignty of God in election. Having preached through Romans 8, 9, 10, and 11. I just went away like with more clarity, and also deeper appreciation. I think there's a reason why Paul concludes chapter 11, the way he does. he breaks out in doxology because he just marvels. And I think it does that to you. Yeah, and then I think I would also, even the place of Israel in God's economy, having preached through Romans 11. I went away convinced of what I already believed.
Wow, all sorts of follow-up questions
Yeah.
that I'd love to ask. Wow. Well, let me ask you the follow-up about, you mentioned mystery.
Yeah.
And I want to come back and hit some of the other questions that I've said, but let me jump to that one. Could I get you to talk just a little bit more about that? And let me just read that section, Romans 11, starting at verse 30, or 33. Oh, the depths of the riches and the wisdom of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. And yeah, that ends the more theological. I hate to say theological. Everything in here is theological.
Yeah.
But it ends that section that has extremely few imperatives, and we have that section that's a whole lot of imperatives to follow. So, very much that's the note he concludes a major section on, where he's just rehearsed the theology of the gospel. But how has that category of mystery, and then also thinking of things in Ephesians 2 about the height, depth, breadth, and width of the love of Christ. Paul talks about knowing this mystery. So it's like there's mystery, and yet it's not something that is just a total blank in our minds.
True.
There is knowledge there at the center of it, and yet that knowledge doesn't erase the mystery, and the reality of mystery doesn't erase the knowledge. So how have you made sense of that in terms of your preaching and what you say about that reality, or the reality of mystery just grown in importance in terms of your thinking?
Yeah, and I think I think in Ephesians 3, his prayer is that you may comprehend the knowledge of God, and you may comprehend the love of God which surpasses all understanding. Yeah, which is almost contradictory, right? Like, I want you to comprehend what is. And I don't think what he means is there's lack of clarity. It's the fact that when you actually understand what God is doing in saving sinners through Christ, his plan and his work, it should baffle us. It should leave us in awe. Like it's in the words of is it Charles or John Wesley? Charles Wesley. How can it be? Right? And that's really when you see how Paul describes salvation in the first 11 chapters of Romans, of what the plan of God is and the result and what not. You think, okay, who else can plan like this? Who else can come up with such a plan and work it out the way God has done? And that is a mystery in itself. And as a result, it leads you to worship. It humbles you. You realize how undeserving you are of this salvation, and yet you are saved. It strips you of every ounce of pride, and really, even when you talk of election, I mean, oftentimes when people discuss election, there's this pride and arrogance and all about it. But if anything, the love of God, the grace of God, the mercy of God in salvation, and even how he secures us, is something to be marveled at. And only God could have planned it. Only God could have worked it out. and that is where the mystery lies. And so we like Paul should simply wonder and worship. Yeah.
That brings up, sort of looking at it from the other end, you're seeing it from God's not wholly from God's perspective, but in the sense of approaching the mystery of who God is. But what about as you've looked at Paul's theology from the perspective of the person of Paul? Obviously, it's his letters that are inspired.
Yeah.
When you read those letters, his apostolic calling to go to the Gentiles, the suffering that he's experienced along the way, God's plan to use that suffering to advance the gospel. He says, filling up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions. All of his epistles are ripe with these personal details and personality that is integral to the way Paul is thinking through what the gospel is and that he is a minister of it. So have you, as you're preaching through Romans, have you grown to appreciate Paul as a person in terms of you thinking you're reading a letter, it's not just this letter that's been inspired by God. I mean, that's the overarching thing, but it's through Paul in terms of how he has written it and his personality. So have you grown to appreciate him as a person more?
Yeah, you have. And, several things jump out. One, how intense he is about the gospel, and how preoccupied he is with the gospel. And that comes as a result of his love for Christ. I mean, Galatians 2:20, the life I live is no longer I who lives, but Christ who lives in me. And he's so passionate about Christ. And because he's passionate about Christ and pursuing him, he then is passionate about the gospel and wanting people to be saved, because that's what pleases him, meaning pleases Christ. So there's this intensity about him in his pursuit of Christ, and this intensity about his preaching of the gospel and living out the gospel. And there's this intensity about his love for people. And he's an intense individual. Even when he's dealing with false teachers, there's this intensity about him. But yet there is also an intense tenderness about his love for those who are in Christ. But then you also agree with Peter. Some things Paul has written are difficult to understand. You kind of read certain things and you're scratching your head and you're like, you could have said this in a simpler, clearer way, But I think, that's one thing you kind of see from Paul. The last thing you'd see is he is so vulnerable. I think it's D.A. Carson who said, every one of us is so particular that people should respect us. Yet Paul is so particular that people shouldn't respect him. He's constantly dissuading people about how unimportant he is. And yet we are the exact opposite. We are so particular that people view us and deem us important. And that's that's Paul.
Like when he says in 2 Corinthians, we do not preach ourselves, but we preach Christ and ourselves as your bondservants.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
Interesting juxtaposition. We don't try to present ourselves. We try to present Christ, and we are your bondservant. As you're describing the characteristics of Paul, I can't help but think that those are also things that that are good characteristics in pastors, in ministers of the gospel as well. True. I mean, really, that's
that's what the pastor should be, right? First Timothy 3. And those are Christ-like virtues. So anyone who pursues Christ will invariably exhibit those characteristics. Yeah.
I think I heard Mark Dever say that when he's looking for people to help train up and equip for ministry, a sense of earnestness, which I think is a lot of what you just described, that passion, that tenacity for the gospel. Like not where they are educationally, not even where they are in terms of total maturity. They can get there.
True.
But this sense of earnestness and its tenacity, the seriousness of it all, that's something that you look for in training people for ministry.
Yeah.
I'm curious too, when you've you quoted D.A. Carson, what books about Romans or Paul's theology in general have you found most helpful?
More on Romans. Schreiner's commentary has been helpful. Then Carson and Moore, their intro to the New Testament, gives you a perspective of who Paul is, and then his epistles. I've also used a study guide that Tim Keller did for his church. There's some notes on Romans, exegetical work by Mark Minnick. In the letter section, I appreciated Christopher Ash's commentary, especially on how to apply and how to approach the text. I'm trying to see if there is another work. Let's see. They elude me. So Moore, Schreiner, used some of John Stott. I think those would be. Later on, MacArthur's commentary on just how he would preach the different passages were helpful in certain sections.
Cool. You've talked a lot about application. And I want to come back perhaps to that at the end too, in terms of just overall thinking about that. But what would you say about the role of justification in the Christian life? I think that sometimes people they get justification right, but then it's in this sort of bubble. Like they got the definition, and that keeps them from being Roman Catholic. But yet it doesn't seem to make it out of that bubble into sort of how they're actually thinking. They can be functionally living out a justification by works, even though they're professing rightly to justification by faith. That doesn't mean that they're not saved, but they're being inconsistent, as we all are to some degree. But how have you thought about the role of justification? And you could write books about this, but just maybe some overall principles here as you preach through that section. And Paul never really leaves the idea of justification after Romans 3 and 4. It shows up again, throughout. But the role of justification in the Christian life, how it actually gets fleshed out, maybe when we're tempted to discouragement, when maybe we fail at something, or maybe when we're tempted to pride and succeed. Just in what circumstances would you see Christians need to have a functional theology of justification?
I think part of the problem is we discuss justification in isolation, but the Bible doesn't do that. So when Paul makes his argument for justification by faith, Romans 3:24 through to Romans 4, the very first word in verse 5, in chapter 5, is therefore. Having been justified by faith, we have peace with God. And then, he talks about our exhorting in God, our hope in suffering, our exhorting in the love of God, and even our holiness. And I think we shouldn't discuss justification and sanctification apart. Justification has implications, and that's what Paul does in the book of Romans. Because you are justified, you are reconciled with God. Now that in itself has massive implications, right? You should endure suffering. You can endure. You are enabled to endure suffering. You rejoice in God. You know of a peace that passes understanding. You can exhort in His love, and then he goes on to in chapter 6 to then say, okay, here's what it means for you to be justified. You're dead to sin. Therefore you're no longer slaves to sin. You're slaves to righteousness, and the reason he talks about that is because he's just talked about justification, right? And I think that should be our approach to justification. There are implications to being justified before God. And that kind of spills out into how we live, because it's a change of identity, right? And your identity affects how you practically live out. And I think that's the importance of justification by faith. There's a reason why the reformers fought for it, but they didn't just end there. They then went on to describe the implications. I just read, I can't remember if it's a book or an article. Someone was making a case for why, how that the reformers and Calvinists simply emphasize justification too much, and to the neglect of sanctification. And I'm thinking, those two are not different things per se. They are connected. There's a difference, but they are connected. You can't discuss one apart from the other. If you do, you lead off in one extreme.
Calvin was famous for saying that those who would want justification without sanctification rend Christ asunder, because both are found in Him, in His person. So therefore, if you want one without the other, you're trying to rip Christ to pieces, which is
So you either become a legalist, or what's the word? Licentious. So that two sides of the same coin.
So you're saying there that if you don't, and one way that people have talked about it is the idea of justification and sanctification being distinct but inseparable.
Exactly.
Which I think is
true.
What you're saying.
I
think you use those words. But if you don't keep them distinct and separable, if you isolate justification from sanctification, either you're going to become legalistic, or you're going to become licentious.
Exactly. True. You have to explain the difference, but you have to keep them together.
Well, there's so many more things we could go in that way. You're hitting upon stuff that's near and dear to my heart as well. But switching from justification to sanctification, the reality of holiness in believers. I don't know if I want to go back and listen to some of those sermons, but the Romans 6, some people talk about definitive sanctification as being a reality. How have you appreciated just the reality of holiness in believers? And you've already mentioned two ways, that whole licentiousness and legalism thing, and so you have Ferguson's The Whole Christ,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
just a beautiful
Exactly.
exposition of how we can go wrong in that area and how we ought to go right. But how do you think Christians sometimes go wrong in their understanding of holiness?
Yeah.
Which I guess could be, well, they're just not holy,
Mm-hmm.
but also could be other more subtle ways
Yeah.
and sometimes more dangerous ways. Because if we're not holy, we obviously should realize something's going on.
Mm-hmm.
But how do Christians go wrong? But confronting that area where they go wrong so that they can go right. Like what ought we to do in terms of thinking about holiness in the Christian life?
Yeah, I think there's the common version of holiness is this outward conformity. So it's don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. And often it's the conforming to people's preferences and standards. Whereas when the Bible talks about holiness, i.e. in Romans, it's the fact that it begins inside and comes outside. So there's this in-outward kind of approach. So the need for renewal of the mind daily, being renewed, and also the fact that it's Christ works in us. The Spirit is working in us through the Word, but we are also making the effort. And the more you are renewed in your mind, in the inner man, the more your outward actions are also sanctified. And the need for it to be clear and evident, because there's also the false notion that inward I'm okay, and yet outwardly you are terrible. It's the fact that it will be clear and evident, and there will be a decreasing pattern of sin and an increasing likeness to Jesus Christ. The other concern I have about our view of holiness is it's negative. It's almost in the what you don't do. Mm-hmm. Holiness is what you don't do, but holiness is also in what you do, what you pursue, what you. It's in your view of Christ, your relationship with Christ. It's actually a beautiful thing, and I don't think we fully appreciate that. We almost talk about holiness in the negative sense. But holiness is a beautiful thing. It's tied to our union with Christ and our growing appreciation and realization of who we are in Christ. And that kind of will then spill out even in our relationships, both within the church and with the outside world. So I think those are some of the false notions of holiness that are out there that are just dangerous. And I think need to be addressed. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I think reminded me that I've seen some church cultures where there is this negative view of holiness. Don't do this. It's easy for people to avoid those really bad sins, or at least avoid them publicly. Appear as if they're in the right, but be really, really immature.
True.
And then it's like it just breeds this sense where they're right to fail massively because they're not actually maturing because they think they're okay, and they're really not, which is a danger. No, I like what you said, though, about holiness being beautiful. And if it's reflecting the holiness of Christ, His holiness is beautiful.
Exactly.
And so our holiness should also be beautiful as well. What have you appreciated about the corporate reality of our salvation, and also our holiness, right? As the church, as a church, in irreducible communal categories, is being made like Christ as his body and bride. So as you're preaching through Romans and Paul's theology in general, how have you sort of appreciated that corporate reality, and also particularly as a pastor? As I was a pastor, and I think I kept wanting to move people to that corporate perspective because that's what I sort of was face to face with in just my life and ministry for the church. So how do you appreciate the corporate reality in Paul? How do you appreciate that, you think, maybe uniquely as a pastor? And what do you want to encourage other people to appreciate as well? Or negatively, what do you think is underappreciated to the detriment of the church because they're not thinking about their holiness and their union with Christ in a corporate dimension and reality?
Yeah. You know, we are a very individualistic society. And I think that has kind of spilled over even into the church. And even our view of our Christian life. We often think of, it's me and my God, just the two of us, private, and even our view of worship is, I've gone and it's just me. But when you actually read Paul's epistles, he's constantly talking of the Christian life in the context of the local church, of the body. So our holiness. So you actually don't find teaching in the Paul's epistles of us living out our Christian life privately. It's always in the context of the local church, of the body, and in many ways, how do you know holiness apart from the context of relationships? How do you know if someone is loving apart from the context of relationships? How do you know exhibit humility privately? It's near impossible. And so, chapter 12, therefore, in light of what he has said about our salvation, he says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and begins to describe what that transformed living looks like. And the first thing he says is, don't think highly of yourself. Instead, lift others up. Well, how do you know that you don't think highly of yourself? It's in the context of relationships in the church.
Right.
Then the very next command is edifying one another by the use of our gifts. Well, how do you do that privately? Then he talks of love and our relationship, and how not to envy, how not to be jealous, etc., etc. How to treat those who mistreat us. Chapter 13 then is submitting to governments and authorities, and it goes on. And chapter 14 and 15 is about welcoming one another, bearing with one another in light of preferences. So you see, all of that is can only be done in the context of meaningful relationships in the body. And the Christian life is really meant to be lived out in the context of the body. So we are not meant to be individualistic or have a consumer mindset and just think about ourselves and how the Christian life is lived out in relationship with one another, encouraging one another, edifying one another, seeking accountability with one another, and I would say it's near impossible to do that privately. Yeah.
I've heard Mark Dever say that the whole idea of just Jesus and me can sound a lot like just me.
Exactly.
In the end.
And that's what it really is. Really, it's just me and what I like and what I prefer, and but even when you think of the Great Commission, it's you go, right? It's go out, make disciples, teach,
Yeah.
develop relationships. So they had all things in common. There's this oneness, this corporateness, and that's very important. And I think that's missing in our individualistic mindset and society.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
It's interesting now as me who've only gotten off the plane a little while ago in Zambia, and then most of the time been quarantined. But it surprises me a little bit that I hear you say that we're so individualistic.
Yeah.
I would expect the pastor in America to say that, but a little surprised to hear you say that. But you think that's true here?
That it is true. I mean, it's probably more in the West because that's kind of a worldview and part of the fabric. Generally speaking, we are more communal in our worldview, but that's been changing over the years, and the individualism kind of springs out even in the communal mindset. It's kind of this selfish. We are together so that I can benefit. But I think with the Western influence and as the world gets smaller, the individualism and the consumerism is also coming here.
Yeah, interesting how our selfish agenda can even corrupt aspects of the worldview that might have God's common grace built in them. The common grace of that corporate communal aspect of Africa gets corrupted when I try to benefit personally from that.
Exactly.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. This is the last question, and then anything else you want to say to edify the students. What would you say to students who are studying the theology of Paul for ministry in terms of the semester's mostly over at this point?
Yeah.
but what particularly could be helpful for them? And maybe you don't have to talk about this one aspect exclusively, but I'm struck by the way that you've constantly talked about application. At one point you said that it's one thing to just understand it in your theoretically, and you've kind of hinted at, well, that's not really understanding it.
Yeah.
This move to application as being essential for the right theological grasp of the idea.
Yeah.
And I think about how John Frame said something in one of his books about how meaning and application shouldn't actually be separated, and that's helped me see that. But I think you're onto something really, really helpful there with just this push towards application. And so, anything about Paul's theology that you encourage students of Paul's theology to pay particular attention to, but also that idea perhaps about not holding these things and not thinking you've understood justification because you can define it, not thinking you understand sanctification, you can define it, but really this move to say, I've got to live these realities out. So you just thoughts in that area.
Yeah. Theology is meant to be lived out. I think one of the danger in academic setting is you're just taking in these theoretical truths and discussing them, and it's just for the head. But theology is meant to be lived out, and it's meant to be applied. But more than that, one thing we learn from Paul is that a pursuit of theology is really a pursuit of Christ. And a person who is grounded in doctrine will have an intense passion and love for God. Will have this love for Christ. Philippians chapter 3, oh, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering. I mean, that was his goal, that I may know him, this experiential knowledge of who Christ is. And when you know him, you become like him, and you want to proclaim him. And that's one thing I would urge and encourage the students to pursue. I have a single passion, and that passion should be the pursuit of Christ. That you can say, the life I live, it's Christ who lives in me. And when you say that, it will be evident. People will look at you and they will see Christ living in you. You're putting off self and you're putting on Christ likeness. But it also will translate in your love for people. You will love God's people, and you will love those who are not God's people by passionately proclaiming the gospel. That's one thing that's evidently clear about Paul. He pursued Christ, and because of that, he loved those who were in Christ and loved those who were not in Christ by proclaiming the gospel passionately. And the pursuit of Christ is not this, just sentimental, emotional kind of, oh, I love Christ, eyes closed, lifting up your hands. It involves rigorous intellectual thinking, and the pursuit of doctrine. I mean, Paul discusses some of the deep theology, but so the two are not separate. When you pursue Christ, you'll be rigorous in your pursuit of doctrine, but you will also be passionately in love with the person of Christ, and that will be seen in your love for people, your love for the church, your love for sinners. Yeah.
Wow, it's encouraging.
Yeah.
You made me think that one thing that a theologian named John Webster said was how we ought not to love our articulation about God more than we love God.
Exactly.
And I think even as we talk about these truths of union with Christ, or how much we've benefited from somebody like Johannes Voss or Sinclair Ferguson, and the way they've articulated these truths can be so meaningful to us. We must never love that articulation more than we love God himself and pursue Christ himself.
Exactly.
And that distinguishes theology for theology's sake versus theology for God's sake. So, and I appreciate you pulling us to theology for God's sake. So.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking your time to answer these questions in a way that I think has been tremendously fruitful and encouraging.
Well, thank you for the time. It's helped me further clarify my own thinking.
It's amazing how that does it.
Yeah.